I'm Autumn Lockett,
And this is Mitch Randall.
and you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, Autumn and I are going to catch up after my trip out to San Diego, California to participate in the BioLogos 2022 Faith and Science Conference. We're going to talk about that. We're also going to talk about poor Vladimir's generals are not telling him the truth. And yes, we are going to spend a little time talking about the slap heard around the country last week at the Oscars when Will Smith stormed on the stage to slap Chris Rock. Not going to spend a lot of time about it, talking about it, but we are going to allude to it during the segment this week. So hope you're having a good week. Stay tuned. It's going to be a good episode.
Rainforest, volcanoes, coastlines with crystal blue water, fresh fruit and seafood. Join Good Faith Media for an immersive experience on Hawaii's Big Island. Discover brilliant night skies with our friend, astrophysicist Paul Wallace. Explore and have fun with your small group of adventurers. Join us May 21st through the 28th. Learn more at faithexperiences.org.
Autumn, welcome me back from California.
Yes, welcome back. The wind, I'm sure, just blew your little airplane straight into the Oklahoma City airport because we are in quite the gust storm these days.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like a wind tunnel out there the whole week since I got back. It's been really, really crazy. It was really warm when we landed in Oklahoma City. The next day, a cold front came in, bringing storms associated with it. And now it's freezing again in the 40s with the wind gusting out of the north. But hopefully spring's going to spring here a little bit, and we'll get some warmer temperatures and calmer winds. But it's good to be back. I had a great time out in California, Autumn.
Yeah, and we alluded to a little bit last week, but really wanted to dig in now that you've had some time to process your notes and to look back over everything that you learned when you were there, that faith and science are not enemies.
They're not enemies. In fact, I write about it this week in my column posted Thursday at goodfaithmedia.org. And one of the things that was fascinating about the BioLogos conference in itself was that it was primarily scientists, and the conversation usually began this way. Well, I was a scientist and an atheist, but I came to the conclusion that science can't answer all of life's questions. Therefore, I needed to know why I mattered. And so I began to explore, ran into this character by the name of J.R. Tolkien or the Shadowlands guy.
C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, thank you. I don't know why.
I'm going to need your Christian card, actually, for that one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I deserve to give that away on that one. Or Lewis. And both Lewis and Tolkien were really instrumental in bringing a lot of these scientists into faith and making it rational for them. And it was just a fascinating conversation. Almost all the scientists who told their personal stories, one of those two scholars were involved in their gravitation to faith. And so it was fascinating to hear those personal stories. One of the conclusions that was drawn from the conference was the need for scientists to be more vocal about their faith, because there is this huge misconception in the world that all scientists are atheists. Now, there are quite a few who are atheists, but it does not mean that all of them are atheists. In fact, there is a vast majority or a vast amount of scientists who profess Jesus as their Lord, who attend Christian services, other people of faith, Muslims, Buddhists, and so we just can't paint with broad strokes and just give into this media conception that has been perpetuated by right-wing media that all scientists are faithless, secularists that have no use for faith whatsoever. And so that was really, really eye-opening to me. Of course, the founder, Dr. Francis Collins, the author of The Language of God, New York Times bestseller book, instrumental in the discovery of the genome, the codes of the genome project, Human Genome Project, and then probably more famous for being Dr. Anthony Fauci's boss at NIH. But he really talked about his faith and the importance of science did not dilute his faith whatsoever. In fact, science helped him appreciate his faith more so, because you look at the complexities of this world that once you dive into it, it is hard to imagine that there is not something cognitive behind it, that there is a designer, in other words. And so it was really, really great to listen to him. But there was a lot of great speeches.
Yeah. As I was reading your article, there was a section that they talked about how that science can't explain why we matter, but that faith sometimes can't explain like how things happen, something to that effect. And that was really powerful.
Yeah. I mean, noted theologian, Oxford trained, Oxford professor, Alistair McGrath. I mean, who, with his accent alone, you just.
And a name like Alistair, you got to believe him, right? I mean, his credibility just baked in.
That's right. So he was speaking and he said, growing up, he wanted to be a scientist. In fact, he was training to be a scientist. And he came to the conclusion later on in life that as much as he loved science, as much as he appreciated and valued this discipline, he began to recognize science could only take humanity so far in answering the questions of the universe. And so he made this kind of gaffe of that science can tell me how far the stars are away from the world, but it can't tell me why I matter.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, faith can't tell me how far the stars are away from the earth, but it can tell me why I matter. And I thought that was a wonderful way of looking at those two. And if, I had an Old Testament professor a long time ago tell me, science and faith are not bitter enemies. In fact, they complement each other very well as long as they answer the questions that they are created to answer. And the Old Testament professor put it this way, that science answers the how and faith answers the who. And I thought that was a good way of clarifying it. I would take it even further and not only say faith answers the question of who, but it also gives us the answer of why.
Yeah.
And so it was a wonderful conference. I recommend going to the conference to the listeners. If it's in your area, log on to the BioLogos website, see what they're all about. Now, I will say this about the conference, that that a lot of the speakers came from the Reformed tradition. And so there's some Calvinistic overtones to the language that you hear from some of the founders as well as some of the participants. And don't get me wrong, that's not a criticism, but just know going in that a lot of talk about the sovereignty of God and the grandeur of God, and therefore there must be this grand designer who is orchestrating the creation of the world and is instrumental in the ongoings of the world. Now, those of us who are a little bit more Arminian, I'm really geeking out on theology here for a second.
Yeah, I was about to press the geek alert, but I was going to let you finish your sentence.
But those of us who are more Arminian in our thought process, meaning that we believe that God created humanity with a conscience and a free will, that there is this beautiful relationship between the grand designer and orchestrator of life and the freedom that he infused within his creation in order to make important decisions. And one of those decisions that came across in the conference is that we as people of faith need to be at the forefront of taking care of this earth. And so climate change is real. There's no disputing that fact whatsoever. It is simple science. It is really looking at data and knowing how to add and subtract. That's pretty much it. If anybody knows how to add and subtract, they can see that climate change is real. I know what you're going to say. There are people.
You know what I'm. You saw my face. You saw my face. That some of the combatants of climate change potentially can't do those things, right?
Well,
And so we'll just bless their heart and move on.
that's right.
Another element of your article that I thought was interesting was that it talked about how people of science, when they are confronted with new data, with new facts, that they change their mind. When you know better, you change and you adapt, and that science is always adapting. And that's not science being weak, that's science being evolutionary and being able to move forward. And I think that's another element that people of faith need to layer into our sort of pattern of life too, that when you know more and when you learn new things, that it's okay to change and to morph and to grow in your thought and to progress. And I think both of these sort of segments of life share that.
Oh my gosh, I could not say that any better because, as of course, a lot of the conversations stemmed from what happened during the pandemic, especially with Francis Collins leading the effort across really the country, but also the world in trying to find a vaccine and how to address the virus early on. You remember early on it was, oh, wear a mask. Oh, don't wear it. You don't have to wear a mask. Oh, well, yeah, you do need to wear a mask. And what he was saying is that what the public was witnessing was science processing data out in the open. It wasn't in a lab anymore.
Yep.
And so it wasn't they were flip-flopping or changing their minds. It was they were responding to the data that they were collecting at a rapid speed. And the more data that they discovered and analyzed, the better conclusions they could draw and therefore offer better evolving solutions to how to respond to the virus in real time.
Yeah.
And what you said about faith perfectly parallels that. I've always said if Jesus were to come back today, I think he would be really disappointed if he came back and saw that our belief system and our actions were just like the first century church.
Mm-hmm.
Because surely over 2,000 years, we would have discovered more about God, and we have, asked deeper questions and discovered deeper answers and done more amazing things with our faith, because that's what we're challenged to do. Jesus did that all the time when he said, you have heard it said, but I say to you.
Yes. Otherwise, why leave us here so long? You know what I mean? Like, what's the point of leaving us here if we're not supposed to learn more and grow more and ask more and move? And I just think it's lazy in science and faith and really whatever element you are in to just sit down on your lazy haunches and say, this is what I know, leave me alone.
Yeah.
That's just lazy. And we don't live in a time when it's okay to be lazy.
I agree wholeheartedly. Well, speaking of getting good information and making decisions based upon accurate data, poor Vladimir Putin is
Bless his heart.
is not getting he's not getting the truth told to him, Autumn, by his top generals. It was revealed this week by intelligence services here in the United States that, in fact, some of his top generals have been lying to him about the state of the war. And I found it, and I hate to use this word amusing because we're still under this horrible war where people are dying.
Mm-hmm.
But it is also somewhat terrifying to think that he's making decisions based upon false information.
Mm-hmm.
Because, as far as he was concerned, what he was hearing was, things are going according to plan. But all across Western Europe and the United States, he's waking up to this morning discovering that what he's been told is not true and that the war is actually going really bad for the Russians. So
good news for the rest of us, right? And I'm going to zoom in because this is where I can apply things where it makes sense. But as a parent,
Mm-hmm.
We want our kids to have open lines of communication with us. And if the first time they come to us with something that's a little squirmy, we fly off the handle and we're scary and we're not approachable, they're not going to come to us with the truth from now on. And this is why when you have a country led by someone who doesn't have anyone who says, "Hey, let me check in with you about this." When there's not a balance of powers, when there's not a two-party system, when there's not voting and democracy and all of these things, you have just unchecked power and it corrupts, like famously so.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing the direct results and consequences of what an authoritarian regime brings and a dictatorship. They want all the benefits of a dictatorship and authoritarianism. They want people to fear them. They want power. They want wealth. They want control. But when you act,
And a legacy,
and a
right? That's
legacy,
this whole land grab situation he's doing.
absolutely. But when you implement these ideals into your governing or ruling practice, then there's also consequences to that. And that is if you kill your political enemies, your friends are not going to tell you the truth. They're going to tell you what you want to hear because
Yep.
they don't want to die because they have seen
Right.
you kill other people.
Right.
So it's been a fascinating couple of months. Again, I don't want to make light of this at all because it's just a horrible situation. We continue to pray for the Ukrainians, for President Zelensky, for their troops, for all the refugees that are fleeing the country, for all of those people who are dying in this war. Our heart grieves for them. But it has been interesting to see how really weak Russia is and how disconjointed they are from having to pull these things off because this should have been a pretty easy victory for them as they invaded Ukraine. I think everybody anticipated that, and the big surprise is to see how disjointed they really are.
Yeah, they are. And I know he's really problematic, not quite as problematic as Putin, but I feel like Putin needs to have like a Dr. Phil moment where Dr. Phil's like, "How's that working for you?" Like, have we thought about sending Dr. Phil over there?
Oh, well, I've thought about it several times, sending Dr. Phil somewhere.
No take backs, no take backs.
Yeah, man, Dr. Oz, they can have them both.
It's a twofer. We got a deal for you, Russia. We can maybe layer in a couple other people too. Speaking of people we might want to layer, right? Into going.
Yeah, I really don't want to talk about this, but it's in the news. I was actually out in Los Angeles after San Diego visiting my son when the Oscars took place on Sunday night. In fact, we were just miles away from the venue itself.
Could you hear the slap? Could you hear it?
Yeah, it echoed all the way over into Glendale, California.
Yeah.
But yes, actor Will Smith, who is now Oscar winner, Academy Award winner, Will Smith, walked on stage after comedian Chris Rock made a joke, and it was to be honest about it. I mean, it was tactless about Jada Pinkett Smith's head, who she's got this condition that she loses her hair. And so he makes this joke, and then Will Smith stands up, walks onto stage, and slaps Chris Rock across the face, and then continues to berate him from his seat after he returns. Apparently, according to the Academy Awards, they asked Will Smith to leave. He refused to leave and was able to stay. He later won Best Actor for his portrayal of Venus and Serena Williams' father, Richard Williams. And when he received the award, he got a standing ovation by the room. And it's just it's taken over a lot of media outlets. People keep talking about it. We're talking about it. But I don't know how to put this. I mean, I tweeted out really quickly after that happened to stay focused, America, because there are bigger things in the world than this. And I really, truly believe that. I mean, war in Ukraine, war in Myanmar, people are suffering across this country financially. Mental health is still a huge problem in this country after coming through the pandemic. So lots of other more important topics to discuss in the world than this. But what was your reaction to it?
So my counterpoint to that, I understand what you're saying. My counterpoint is that statistically, when we are in crisis, as a people, as a community, as individuals, we really lean on entertainment as an escape. And I think that has been especially true in the past couple of years. Things like horror films really skyrocketed after 9/11 because we wanted to be scared in a way that we could control, in a way that would be tied up with a bow at the end of it. And I think that, I mean, you have a kid in the entertainment industry. There's a lot of folks who are really relying on that sort of population of folks to distract us from what's going on. And it's important to, yes, we have to watch the news, we have to stay informed, we have to do what we can. But we also sometimes need to like take a break and just watch Bob's Burgers,
Sure.
and I think that's maybe what the Oscars was. And people were watching it to see the pretty dresses, to hear the speeches, to see, me as a parent, I have this like long list of movies that someday I'm going to have time to watch these Oscar winners. And so looking at who's nominated and who wins, and then just to see this just violence. We're sort of over violence. We're sick of it. And I think it was a shock to people who were looking to this as a place to escape.
Yeah.
And then it ended up being just another negative place for us.
Yeah. And I agree with you wholeheartedly. I mean, entertainment certainly is our best escapism that we have. Professional sports would be that for some, and it's a shame that that got marred. That situation marred overall. Some really cool things happened, such as Lady Gaga bringing out Liza Minnelli, which was just a beautiful, beautiful moment.
Precious. Yep.
And then the cast of Coda winning Academy Awards. I mean, there were some great moments that, it started to feel a little bit normal. I mean, coming out of the pandemic, and then
nobody was masked, right?
Yeah, and then this happens, and so, but yeah, as a father of a comedian who's trying to break through, I mean, it is a little alarming that people, could possibly rush the stage now if they don't like one of his jokes and hit him.
Just throw tomatoes like they used to at Fozzie Bear. Come on. It was good enough for the Muppets.
Well, I mean, comedians are used to getting heckled. I mean, that just happens. I mean, that's the give and take between the audience and the performer. That's part of it. There's certainly a line that entertainers don't attempt to cross, and they hope that the audience respects that line as well. Sometimes comedians step over that line, and the industry tries to correct them when they do. And usually that, means you're going to lose work, you're going to lose contracts, things like that. But it was just strange. Now, the one thing I do have to say about the whole event itself was, I don't know Chris Rock. I don't know Will Smith. I have no judgment on them as individuals. I do have some thoughts on this one act, but I have to say, Chris Rock can take a punch because that dude got slapped on national television and went right back to delivering that award with like not skipping a beat. So I was just, I would have been crushed. I would have been like, crying and whimpering and, calling out Will Smith for slapping me and walking off stage and stuff like that. But man, he kept his cool and he kept delivering the award. So it was an interesting blip on the calendar for us. I know that many of you may have hot opinions about that as well. And if you do, please send all of those to Autumn Lockett. She would love to talk to you about it.
And here's going to be my response. Like, I'll go ahead and say it, and I'll type it out, save it as a template if you have problems to tell me about. I also think there's something to do with the fact that we've all been through a lot collectively as a world for the past 2 years, and nerves are frayed and emotions are close to the skin. And we all are lacking a little bit of self-control that may have been there, and therapy is important. Finding safe places to talk through how you're feeling without using your hands is important. And I just would encourage all of you to consider therapy because I think it's good for everyone.
I would say add a big amen to that. So thanks for the reminder, Autumn. Well, you and I get to sit down with a very interesting scholar this week, Sam Perry, who is a professor. A neighbor. He's a professor at the University of Oklahoma. I was in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago preaching at Riverside Baptist Church there in the District of Columbia, and opened up the Washington Post and read a report by a committee that talked about the rise of radicalism nationalism within white Christian nationalism. And lo and behold, Sam was part of that report. And so we brought him on the pod this week to talk about that report, talk about some of the trends that he is seeing within white Christian nationalism and why we as a people of good faith need to combat that rising tide. And so it's a great conversation. He's got a new book out that he's going to tell you about. So we want to encourage you to stay tuned, and Sam Perry be up next.
Marvel at Pacific Coast wells, wonder in rainforests, explore wild coastlands and towering cliffs. Join Good Faith Media for a unique and immersive experience in the Pacific Northwest and Olympic National Park. Enjoy engaging conversation with your small group of adventurers led by our team, which includes a journalist, historian, and theologian. Join us July the 23rd through 30th. Learn more at faithexperiences.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest all the way from across town here in Norman, Oklahoma. An award-winning scholar and teacher at the University of Oklahoma, Dr. Samuel Perry is among the nation's leading experts on conservative Christianity and American politics, race, sexuality, and families. Along with numerous articles published in leading academic journals, Dr. Perry has also authored or co-authored 4 books, including Growing God's Family, Addicted to Lust, Taking America Back for God, and his forthcoming book, The Flag and the Cross, which is due out April 1st of this year, about how the scientific study of religion benefits all of society, and another book about how culture, wars, and consumer markets shape English Bibles. Dr. Perry, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
All right. So, Dr. Perry, I have to admit, I was in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago, and I was preparing to deliver a sermon at Riverside Baptist Church down in the Wharf District. And I opened up the Post, and I was reading this article, and lo and behold, University of Oklahoma jumps out at me. I thought, oh, my goodness, there's a fellow Sooner here. So you participated in a report a few weeks ago in D.C. hosted by the Congregational Free Thought Caucus. The briefing was entitled, God is on Our Side, White Christian Nationalism and the Capitol Insurrection. The report revealed a deep concern that is becoming more radical and targeting voters. So just briefly, can you kind of explain your involvement in the report and how that report came to be?
Sure. So my co-author and I, Andrew Whitehead, after writing our book, Taking America Back for God, we've been collecting several years of data along with several other colleagues, and we've been writing about this topic. And so I think our contribution to that report was to try to understand the prevalence of Christian nationalism as an ideology in the American population. Our contribution hasn't been so much to, say, diagnose the events of January 6th, the symbolism. Of course, all of us saw all those things going on, and we were shocked as anybody. But I think what we have contributed to the conversation is trying to understand the underlying ideology and those foundations that might give covering to or even give rise to that kind of white Christian nationalist response to, say, perceptions that one is having an election taken from them, that one is under attack from various forces of elites and politicians and the media, and how people are responding to that, and even reinterpreting the events of January 6th in a more positive light. We're starting to document those kinds of things. And so we want to understand the scope of white Christian nationalism, and specifically in that report, how it informs our understanding of what took place January 6th.
So before we get into some of the findings of the report, Dr. Perry, one of the things that I just really found a relief in is that there are those of us who have been working within the church, working within faith communities, that has seen this continued rise of Christian nationalism across the country. And we've been seeing it for decades. I'm former Southern Baptist. I got kicked out of Southern Baptist because of my beliefs. And we have been combating this fusion of church state in ideology and now practice. And so when we saw the events unfold on January 6th of 2021, we were just all appalled, but also it was like, yeah, we saw this coming, and we were shocked by it, but some of us were not so much as shocked because of the rhetoric that we have heard for decades. This is the culmination of this intensifying of rhetoric that we've seen in the country. So, why this focus? Is it now? Was it just the insurrection, or have we been seeing other outliers emerge that has now brought scholars and politicians together and thinkers together to say, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah, absolutely. So it has been building for a long, long time, and in fact, Phil Gorski and I have a book that drops at the end of this week, The Flag and the Cross. And what we actually begin that book by talking about the Capitol insurrection, best thought of as an eruption of forces that have been building for a long, long time. So those things were roiling beneath the surface. As you said, that this is not, as my colleague Andrew Whitehead says, the event was shocking but not surprising, right? Shocking in its extent and its chaotic violence. And yet not surprising considering the kinds of things that we have seen set in motion for a long, long time. And there's a variety of things going on there. I mean, I think you have religious and racial and political realignments going on over the last few decades in the United States, where, let's give you some examples, the Republican Party, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, I'm just kind of documenting what is taking place statistically. The Republican Party has moved toward ideological purity faster than the Democratic Party has. The Democratic Party is still very much a coalition of, you can get conservative Black Protestants and liberal mainliner Christians and a lot of secular Americans all moving around within this group. It's very racially diverse, and politicians have to speak to that kind of diversity. The Republican Party, by contrast, has moved toward conservative and extremely conservative at a lot faster pace. They are becoming disproportionately white and disproportionately white Christian or white evangelical. So that being said, what you have is a more unified group of people that Republican leaders can speak to, mobilize, and activate with this kind of consistent rhetoric of we are being persecuted, we are being targeted, our America is being taken away from us. Christian nationalism is a part of that story. It's a part of that narrative. And just to jump off of that, Christian nationalism is also within context understood globally as a part of this broader movement that we are seeing of what I would call ethno-traditionalism. That is like, hey, we need to go back as a culture to this kind of ethno-culture, this way of life where people like us were in charge, where we had all the cultural and political power. The Christian nationalism, white Christian nationalism in the United States, is a brand of this kind of populist ethno-traditionalism that we're seeing take place in Hungary and Russia and Brazil and other places around India, and not even the Christian kind, right? Like it's just the Hindutva movement. You've got that kind of populist, authoritarian ethno-traditionalism taking place. So in the United States, in our particular context, you've got a group of people who are increasingly feeling targeted, like that the country that belongs to them rightfully. And if you are a white Christian conservative American, that is the narrative that you've been told, that the country was founded by people like you, for people like you, and that activist judges and the libs and Obama especially have been trying to take it from you. And so mix that with a whole lot of misinformation and a lot of conspiratorial thinking already, and after the election, I mean, you've got an eruption of those kinds of forces that say, hey, we're not going to take it anymore. In fact, when you look at the prayer, I was just writing about this today. In fact, when you look at the prayer of that QAnon shaman on the Senate chamber, it is remarkably consistent. The words that he uses, remarkably consistent with the kind of rhetoric that we are seeing. He thanks his heavenly Father for filling that chamber with patriots that love God and that love Christ, and for allowing those rioters to send a message to the communists and the tyrants and the globalists that this is our nation, not theirs, that America will be reborn as what it was supposed to be, right? Like you have this kind of narrative of something being these people are trying to steal it from us. We have taken it back with your power. I think even though the Capitol insurrection is obviously an extreme example, I think the underlying ideology in white Christian nationalism is something that has been building, stoked by far-right politicians and in churches and in these forces that I think are feeding into this kind of misinformation conspiracy, but also that narrative of the country belongs to us, not you.
Mm-hmm. So, in a Washington Post report about the briefing, your research shows a powerful correlation between people who subscribe to Christian nationalist beliefs and anti-democratic beliefs. You touched on that a little bit earlier. What is in your research that indicates this conclusion?
Right. So in our surveys, and we have just been really blessed to within the last 2 or 3 years collect data, data set after data set. We've got this, we've gotten these resources to be able to collect what's called panel data. More on that in a little bit, but basically what that means is like we follow the same group of Americans over a period of 2 years, starting pre-COVID and post-COVID. So we go from like August 2019 to August 2021, and we've been following these Americans and asking them similar questions, sometimes different questions. And so what we found right before the election, but this is before there was any talk of stolen election, October 2020, we give a survey to these Americans, and we ask them to how much they agree with statements like, we make it too easy to vote already in this country, and the various kinds of things that they would support. And we found that Christian nationalism, especially among white Americans, is strongly associated. It's one of the most powerful predictors that you believe you already make it too easy to vote, even before the election, that you would support hypothetical laws that would require civics tests in order to vote. That's like Jim Crow kind of requirement.
Yeah, it is.
Some kind of barrier. Or that you would disenfranchise certain felons for life. That you think voter fraud is rampant. Again, even before the election, that you think voter fraud in the election is already rampant. Just the opposite, that you don't think voter suppression is a problem at all, right? Like that hasn't been going on at all. That you would, that you don't necessarily envision a society being improved by everybody participating in democracy. That one that happened just recently. This is one that we collected even after the book that Phil and I wrote together. We collected this in August 2021, and I'm writing about this right now. We asked Americans whether you think voting is a right or a privilege. Right? It's just a simple question: is voting a right or is it a privilege? And thankfully, the majority of Americans are very much of the opinion that voting is a right. But the more white Americans subscribe to Christian nationalism, it basically is a linear trend. The more you affirm Christian nationalist beliefs, the more you're likely to say that it is a privilege, not a right. Why is that important? Well, because it's a privilege, then it is something that we can take away from you. That is something that you can lose. If it's a right, it is something that shall not be infringed, and you can't make it more difficult for people to access a right. But if it's a privilege, then hey, it's got to be something you earn, and it's got to be something that we can take away if we want. And so this is what I mean by white Christian nationalism is anti-democratic in that it is of the opinion, or it tends to be of the opinion, that only the worthy, only people like us should be allowed to participate in political representation in the kind of country that we want to build. And that is antithetical, of course, to our founding principles and what I think we would all like to say America is about.
Yeah, there was some outstanding reporting that took place in the report itself. As I read through it, there were some things there that were both extremely insightful and, quite frankly, terribly terrifying at the same time. And so there's some conclusions I want you to expand upon. One of these is the point that white Christian nationalism and Christianity are not one and the same. And I think that is an important delineation, especially for our audience who are people of faith, who prescribe to the Christian tradition, but often get lumped into this Christian nationalism movement within the United States. Those two are not the same. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, and this is something that we try to emphasize in all of our books. And I would even say that I'll go even further. Christian nationalism is not the same as white evangelical. Right. So I think people often assume that, and matter of fact, I had to correct a podcast host the other day who I was saying white Christian nationalism, and he kept saying white evangelical nationalism or something like that. Right. And it's like, this is not what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking about like white evangelicals, even though, your listeners can't see this, but the Venn diagram of Christian nationalism and white evangelical is not a circle, right? Like it's close though, right? They're close. They are certainly close, but there are white evangelicals and certainly lots of Christians who are terrified by what they see in Christian nationalism. They reject it completely, and they say that is inconsistent. In fact, Southern Baptists, I mean, even though Southern Baptists, if we want to use them as an example, and I can show you this data statistically, like Southern Baptists have been moving far right quickly. They are, statistically speaking, they are increasing in their adherence to Christian nationalist ideology. Yet historically, in their own founding document, or not founding documents, but in their own legacy, religious freedom, religious liberty, autonomy in that respect was always something that they prided themselves on as a
Look
group.
at him preaching to the choir.
I know. I mean, you can't listen to George Truett's sermon on the steps of the Capitol and not understand the legacy of Southern Baptist.
Yeah.
Their adherence towards separation of church and state, and even more recently, in fact, I think Russell Moore was actually at the report the other day, or at least commented on the report. You know, he was a staunch supporter of separation of church and state. Got him in trouble. You know,
Right.
he lost his job with the Southern Baptist Convention. But there are people within the Southern Baptist Convention that believe exactly what you're saying. So you're exactly right.
Right. And so we want to be very clear that we are not talking about all Christians when we're talking about Christian nationalism. When we're talking about white Christian nationalism specifically, we're talking what I would describe as more of an ethnocultural and political orientation. That is more, like I said this on Twitter the other day, like it is increasingly, statistically even, and descriptively, I think this is more accurate, to talk about a rather than a Christian right, to talk about a pro-Christian right? Like it is where identifying as a Christian, even identifying as a Christian doesn't matter as much as whether or not you are for a particular kind of ethnocultural hegemony or an ethnocultural supremacy of white conservative Christian politics, cultural values, and that kind of. And you want to see that institutionalized in American culture and politics in a way that you feel like, even if you're not a Christian, it just means good people like us are in charge and not the other guys, not the bad guys.
Right.
So Christian nationalism is not the same as being a Christian, not the same as being a white evangelical or a Southern Baptist. And in fact, oftentimes we find, and we talk about this at length in our first book, Taking America Back for God, that oftentimes we find that once we account for Christian nationalism in our little statistical models, the more religious you are, we actually find it often goes in the opposite direction. So, for example, Christian nationalism is often associated with xenophobia, fear of outsiders, racial prejudice, rejection of any kind of gun legislation. All those kinds of things. We find that once we account for Christian nationalist ideology in our statistical models, the more religious you are, the less xenophobic you are, the less racially prejudiced you are, the more in favor you are of, say, common sense gun legislation. Any kind of regulation at all. What this suggests to us is that once we remove the effect of Christian nationalist ideology from, say, our hypothetical or kind of statistical survey of people, we find that religious commitment seems to be associated with being more pro-social, more pro-democratic, but the kind of neighbors that you would want. In other words, so somebody who is very religious but is not a Christian nationalist would be the kind of person that you would like to live next to. They seem like a kind of winsome, tolerant, inclusive kind of person. Not like those things are just the greatest values and that we need to hold those things as the highest priority, but those are the things that we feel like are basically the opposite of what we're getting with Christian nationalism. It tends to be very exclusivist, very into hierarchies, very into rigid authoritarian means of social control. And with religious people, we don't necessarily, with people, once we account for Christian nationalism, people who are more religious seems to be more pro-social, democratic, less authoritarian. And I think confirms that, we're not talking about religious people necessarily or committed Christians. We're talking about people who adhere to a particular ideology. I also want to be clear that we're not talking about hey, Christians, you can't vote your values. Like, you keep your faith out of our politics. Like that is an impossibility. Like, we always will vote our values. Our values are always shaped by our culture, and religious commitments are a part of that. So we're not trying to say Christians can't be patriots and into politics, that they need to keep their religious noses out of it. We're not saying that at all. And several of the writers, I won't speak for my co-authors, that we are Christians and we are concerned about this kind of thing. I was on that panel with Jamar Tisby, and Jamar Tisby share a common religious identity, not in common with, say, Andrew Seidel, who is also on that panel, who is an atheist and speaks for other interests. But we are united in our belief that Christian nationalism is a problem and it's contributing to a lot of, I think, division and chaos in our world. But
And not just in our world, a lot of our listeners are faith leaders, they're pastors, they're laity, leadership in the church. And so this thing that you're describing, that the more religious you are, either takes you like sort of to this extreme, or if you're being influenced by Christian nationalism, it can take you to this extreme.
Right.
This explains a lot of the sort of friction that we're seeing within the church, and why I think this also can speak so much to what we're hearing about church attendance dwindling, because people sense that friction, and there is friction in every part of our lives right now. We're in a pandemic, we have a war raging, there are fuel costs, all these things that are happening. Why would we want to spend our Sunday morning holding tension in a room with people? And what do we do with that? And I think pastors they're really trying. They've got feet in two separate tectonic plates, and it's really tricky business.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Dr. Perry, another conclusion that we read in the report is how easily Christian nationalists are susceptible to misinformation and lies. During the pandemic, it was just paramount, and then of course heightened on the whole issue of Stop the Steal. But not only are they susceptible to these lies, Dr. Perry, they believe in these lies so much that they are deeply, and I mean deeply, committed to defending them. Did you get any evidence to understand why they are?
Yeah, absolutely. So Christian nationalism is at bottom about us versus them tribalism, right? So it is. And so when you are that deep into a particular view that is really committed to a sense of being persecuted and aggrieved, that something is being stolen from you. That narrative is part and parcel of Christian nationalism, that this country was Christian. It used to be this kind of bastion of values and biblical worldview, and all of these, I think, what are largely myths of our own like heritage and legacy. Then you feel like you look at the country now and you feel like, hey, that really fits into a narrative of something being robbed by various parties, oftentimes people that you don't even know. You're just kind of told like, hey, these people are coming after you and taking your stuff, taking what's yours, and trying to twist our country and deface it, and wrecking the prosperity of our once great nation. I mean, that was Trump's promise: is make America great again, taking it back for the good people like us. I mean, it's just quote after quote. Trump would say like, hey, we're going to make it. We're going to rally around Christianity. We're going to make this is going to be the thing that unites us and saves us. And so when you are that deep in that kind of like tribal mentality, you are suspicious of anything that even hints at something that is criticizing you, or that is a loss for you, that is that questions the narrative of your own righteousness and inevitable victory, to where losses just become these catastrophic events where you just you couldn't interpret your world if you would understand that like this is, hey, America is just not responding to this kind of thing, and Americans by and large don't want this. So the conspiracy mindset is I think goes along with the distrust of anybody outside of our group. And that is broadly speaking the elites. It's the scientists, it's the leftist media, it's the academics like me, it's the Democrats, it's even establishment politicians, which is one of the reasons why Trump was so popular, because he was had the perception of like an outsider guy who doesn't play like the other politicians do. And so when we asked Americans in our surveys, just to get to the bottom of it, when we asked Americans in our surveys, say who they trusted for COVID information, it was actually shocking. We talk about this. I mean, it's one of those things that like you look at the charts, you look at the data, and you're just blown away by how strong this is. But say the more Americans, white Americans in particular, affirm Christian nationalist ideology, the less likely they were to trust the CDC, scientists, medical experts for, say, COVID information. And as that went down, trust for Trump went up. They trusted Trump more than anybody, and more than the CDC, more than the scientists, more than the experts, more than the researchers, because for them it was all about, okay, who is our guy, who is the inside information for us, which is one of the reasons why like Trump's participation on Twitter. I mean, even though people like to talk about it as a free speech kind of thing, Trump's participation on Twitter, when you have 90 million followers and you're tweeting misinformation 12 times a day from your bathroom, and you just don't really care. I mean, it's really difficult to overemphasize the how toxic that was for our being able to grapple with COVID. COVID is a great example of that. Like, why COVID was this asteroid heading toward our planet that theoretically should have united us.
Right.
When you think about the kind of thing that we would come together as a world, or as a nation at least, and say, you know what, let's get past our petty differences so that we can work together to defeat the thing that is killing people. That's what it should have been.
Yeah.
And yet we immediately polarized over it. You had rejection of masks and rejection of vaccines even. And a lot of that was because of the spread of fear, misinformation. Trump was one example of that. I think places like American Family Radio, where I still like American Family Radio, where we are in Norman, is as far as I know of, the only major Christian talk radio that is available. And if you listen to AFR, I mean, it's vaccine suspicion every day, right? Like it's and so that kind of tribal mentality gives rise to a distrust of any kind of experts, and you only trust people like us, people who are on our side. That meant for the last 5 years, Trump.
And that is a fascinating revelation, because over the weekend I was out in San Diego, California at the BioLogos conference. The founder is Francis Collin, former NIH director, better known as Dr. Fauci's boss for the last several years. And Dr. Collin spoke about his incredible surprise. He is a professing Christian, wrote the book Language of God, which is remarkable, but he talked about his complete surprise at the rejection of the vaccine by a large portion of Christianity. And it all led back to this susceptibility of misinformation, believing misinformation and lies. And of course, without saying it, it led back to the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And so that's one of the other questions that we have for you, Dr. Perry. Why Trump? Why is Trump the messiah of Christian nationalists? Because you look at this guy, and at every level, he is everything that a person of faith would think. This is not the person we want to lead us.
My favorite story about that, Sam, is my parents are both Trump, anti-vax, anti-mask, all of those things. And in like 2016, I asked my dad, I said, Dad, if I was friends with Trump's daughter, would you let me spend the night at their house? Like, would that be a safe place for me? And he said, oh, absolutely not. And I said, but you want him to be in the White House. Make it make sense. So how do you square this?
Right. So, I think the best example I can think of is Tony Perkins was asked, maybe 2018, he was asked by Politico, hey, the Stormy Daniels thing, help us make sense of like why evangelicals could support a president who apparently paid off a porn star that he'd slept with, while his wife was recovering from pregnancy. And Tony Perkins said we were willing to give him a mulligan. And the way he explained it was, we evangelicals were tired of being pushed around by Obama and his leftists. We were glad somebody was willing to step up and fully. And I think that's the best articulation of like what Trump meant to them. He was a guy who promised, like, you guys are being attacked. Christianity, and I have quote after quote after quote that like I have these all kind of on a file. Christianity is under siege. They are treating you badly. What happened? The media, the politicians, they've forgotten you. I will be the person who goes to fight for you. He said this in 2016. Christianity will have power. If I'm in the White House, we won't need anybody else. We'll say Merry Christmas again. We will, all of these things. Christianity will have power. You're going to have someone representing you very, very well. And so it was that promise of I will be the person who fights to make our country, not just great again, Christian again, for people like us again. And we will marginalize those voices that we feel like have tried to take what is ours: the leftists, the socialists, the globalists, the immigrants, the Muslims, the people who are not like us. And so I really don't. You do have some evangelicals who really, I think, have tried to wrestle with this big dissonance by just lying to themselves, like the James Dobson talking about a baby Christian or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have a lot of people who are just at least live in reality enough to acknowledge that, like, hey, Trump is not a Christian. He's a horrible.
It was just
bully of a person. But it's surprising because I was in Dallas, First Baptist Dallas, when Trump was giving the Christmas address last December. So this December, of course, I had to drive down to go see First Baptist Dallas and go witness.
You didn't have to, but you did.
Professionally obligated.
There you go.
I could not live with myself as a sociologist who studies these things and not do that. And at the end of his little message, which was as chaos as always with Trump. At the end of his message, he's walking off stage and he starts the chant USA, USA. And so all the First Baptist megachurch Dallas is saying this, and the people behind me changed the chant to say, "We love you, we love you, we love you." And I'm just kind of, what is going on?
Right.
But it just shows that these people were not just, some of these folks at least.
Yeah.
We're not just like, hey, he's the guy who fights for us, but they genuinely thought he was no, I like this guy.
Yeah. It almost, and we are, dead set in the middle of Lent. Holy Week's coming up pretty soon. And it just reminds me of that, that encounter right before Jesus was crucified, of the decision that the crowd had to make.
Give us Barabbas.
And they said, give us Barabbas. And that's exactly what I see, because I just mesmerized, because there are other politicians out there that are, more akin to their ideology, that believe in their ideology, certainly have more values. I disagree with them wholeheartedly. Ted Cruz, for example.
Right.
I disagree with about everything that comes out of Ted Cruz's mouth, but at least, he's married, he's a good family man,
right.
And I was just mesmerized that they went after this guy. This was their guy.
Well, and just some more on that, there was this narrative after the 2016 election. And I think a lot of evangelical leaders were embarrassed by this, obviously, and we're trying to reconcile. I think the poor witness, it's bad public witness that evangelicals, 80% or 81% of evangelicals voted, and more did so in 2020. And I think they were trying to reconcile this by saying, hey, once it became clear that Trump was going to get the nomination, of course, they just voted for the party rather than they voted for the team rather than the coach. You know what I'm saying? They voted for, and they held their noses and voted for Trump. And that actually is false. We actually have data from January 2016 that showed how Trump stacked up against Cruz, Carson, Bush, Rubio, all of these guys with evangelical bona fides. And Trump was slaying them all, among white evangelicals, among white church-going evangelicals, among people who affirmed a stronger place for religion in the government. Trump was always coming out ahead, even before it was a foregone conclusion that he was going to get the nod as the president. And so it really wasn't just kind of a marriage of necessity. Evangelicals really wanted him. They really wanted that guy. Even when Pence, during Trump's first impeachment, if Trump would have been kicked out of office, Pence would have been the president.
Right, exactly.
Legitimate evangelical credentials there.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't want Pence. They
wanted to hang Pence, if you remember.
Right. Yeah, and this is what Phil and I said. They didn't want a guy who fights. They want a guy who fights for Christians, not fights like a Christian. You know what I'm saying? That's the last thing they want, is a guy who fights like a Christian. They want a guy who fights for Christians. And they don't care how it happens.
Yeah, sure. All right, so I could literally talk about this all day with you, Dr. Perry, because I'm just fascinated by it.
Let's meet at the Mont after this, okay? First swirl's on me.
For those of the audience who are not from Norman, that is our local college hangout spot. So, but the last question that I have before I turn it over to Autumn is, okay, this could be really depressing. And to be quite honest with you, it is really depressing when you look at the data and some of the outcomes of this data. But there are so many good people out there who are faithful to their tradition, who are following Jesus, doing some remarkable things, who do not prescribe to Christian nationalism. Us, for example, one of your co-authors in the report, Amanda Tyler, with the Baptist Joint Committee. I actually chaired the Baptist Joint Committee years ago. Amanda's a colleague of mine.
Friend of the
good
pod.
Friend.
She's a friend of the pod.
Yeah. In fact, we did the video work for Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We were part of that movement. So what can people of good faith do to combat this rise in radicalism of Christian nationalism?
I think, my advice would be to reject I think the kind of partisan rhetoric that is like exacerbating this. I think the demonization of other groups. I mean, it's unchristian for one, but I think that it's beyond. I think the moral obligation we have to live out Christian values and to avoid that kind of thing that would, I think, implicate our own witness and compromise our own witness. I think publicly. I would think that it is also ineffective politically. I think the polarization only benefits the radical right, because they get to own that we're persecuted. They hate us. They really do. They hate us, and they're coming after us. And the language, they're so nasty, and they're so like, look at them, And I think engaging in that kind of thing rather than trying to diffuse it. It doesn't mean roll over. It doesn't mean give in. But it does mean that we have an obligation, I think, not to make that situation worse by being just as ugly as the people that we feel like are being ugly. So I think that's just kind of a Christian approach for one. But also, and also a politically smart approach. So like if you so in their book, Levitsky and Ziblatt, the Harvard professors who wrote How Democracies Die, which is a fantastic book, and it's something I recommend, should be required reading for us all. One of the things they do, and I'm so glad they do at the end of this book, is they say, hey, what should say the Democratic Party do if, and they wrote this before the 2020 election, should the Democratic Party double down and do just what the Republican Party did over the last however many years? And they say, absolutely not. Like, that is just going to exacerbate the problem. That's going to make it worse. What we need to do is we need to build coalitions with people who, like, say, Jamar Tisby and I, alongside somebody like Andrew Seidel, who is a great guy who happens to be an atheist, but we also happen to be united in our concern together that white Christian nationalism is a problem and it's toxic, and it is not going to produce the kind of democracy we feel like is good for us all. So I think as Christians, we have to be willing to partner with people who are in agreement and rightly bothered by this kind of emergent ideology, so that we can actually get things done for our country, for us all, not rather than just sink into just this tribalistic partisan battle where it just becomes sports on TV. Like we just, I hate the other politician, like I hate Tom Brady or the Patriots or whoever, right? Like that's when it's gotten so toxic that this is, it's devoid of all kind of connection to reality. And I think it prohibits us from being able to accomplish anything.
Well, damn it, Autumn. Leave it to the sociologists to teach us the golden rule and bring Jesus into this, that we should treat others as we want to be treated.
I know. Well, but okay, and I am going to ask our last question. But earlier on, you were talking about how the right has done like almost a better job of like lining up behind like one sort of party line, because they are a little more, one note, for lack of a better word, and where the left is a bigger tent, it's harder to have a unified rallying cry. And I think what you were talking about and being, kind of putting aside sort of our differences and finding spaces that we can hold together and be strong is so important. It's hard work, but it's so important for us to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is hard work. It's easier, frankly, to just go for ideological purity and to just draw hard lines and to say you're in and you're out, or you're in and you're out.
Loud. Just be louder.
Just to be loud and angry and shout people down rather than to come to the table and compromise. But that is in its best form, politics at its best is compromise, so that we can figure out how to best serve all of us. And especially in a country as diverse as the United States, we can't unite around a common ethnoculture. Like that is just not. It's not who we were, but it's definitely not who we are, and it's not who we're becoming. And so that ship has sailed. That reality is gone, and it is fantasy to think that we can go back to that. So we have to rally together around common creedal commitments to things that we see in the Declaration of Independence: full legal equality, natural rights of human beings, government by the people, right? Like, and these are things that we can all celebrate and say, like, you know what, we are united as Americans in our commitment to liberty and freedom and equality. And what does that look like? Well, we've got to figure that out, and we can hash that out. But those are the commitments.
Absolutely.
Dr. Perry, thank you so much for joining us at Good Faith Weekly. I could just talk to you about this all day. But before we let you go, Autumn's got one last question that she asked all of our guests. So, Autumn, take it away.
Our tagline at Good Faith Media is "There's more to tell." In light of our conversation and your upcoming book and the state of our nation, what is your more to tell?
I see one positive trend and one warning along with that positive trend. So the positive trend is that, and multiple survey sources now, everything from Pew to Public Religious Research Institute to the Baylor Religion Surveys to the General Social Survey, a bunch of different data sets. We see that adherence to Christian nationalists, say ideology or Christian nationalist views, is declining as in a percentage of Americans. More Americans are not subscribing to Christian nationalist ideology. And part of that, a large part of that, in fact, is demography. Like older generations are dying off, younger generations are replacing them.
Because they won't take the vaccine, right? I mean,
right. That's part of the story, I'm sure.
Yeah.
But it's, there's this kind of, along with, I think, a slowly moving rise in secularization, you do see a slow decline in Christian nationalist ideology. But the warning there is that just because Christian nationalism may be declining among the general population doesn't mean people who really do subscribe to Christian nationalist ideology aren't becoming more radicalized and militant as their group shrinks. Right? Christian nationalism isn't just something that is stable. It responds to threat. It grows, in fact, in response, and not only in its size, but in its radicalism and its militancy in response to perceived threat. So as this group of people continues to diminish, and they do feel even more aggrieved, more targeted, and more persecuted, then I think you have the potential for an explosive kind of response. And so even though I think we are heading in the right direction in terms of this kind of ideology minimizing in the mainstream, I think we actually need to be vigilant that we diffuse any kind of radicalization on the right that I think could be on the horizon.
Well, Dr. Samuel Perry from the University of Oklahoma, thank you so much for joining us this week. It has been a delight, sir, to talk with you. Dr. Perry's forthcoming book, The Flag and the Cross, will be out April 1st this week. So make certain that you purchase it wherever you pick up your reading materials. So, Dr. Perry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
And to our audience, we want to thank you for joining us as always. And Autumn and I will be back next week with another great guest. And until then, keep living good faith.